What does it actually take to go from being physically blocked by creditors at the city gates to controlling the wealthiest empire on the face of the earth? Because that's not a metaphor or an exaggeration. That literally happened to Julius Caesar. At 40 years old, his debts were so enormous, so completely out of control, that the men he owed money to showed up in person to stop him from leaving Rome. They weren't going to let him walk out the door until someone vouched for him. And 10 years after that humiliating moment, he was the most powerful man alive. This isn't really a war story, though there's plenty of war in it. This is a story about money, leverage, and one of the most calculated financial gambits in human history. Caesar was born in 100 before Christ, into the Julii, an ancient patrician family with an impressive name and, increasingly, not much else. The family bloodline went all the way back to the goddess Venus, or so they claimed, which comes across as perfectly standard and decidedly self-serving when you're trying to borrow money. But the prestige was real, even if the cash wasn't. By the time Caesar was a young man navigating Rome's political world, his family had fallen on hard times. They had the connections, the name, and the social standing, but they didn't have what the Roman political machine actually ran on. And what it ran on was money. Enormous, almost unimaginable amounts of money. Here's how the system worked, and it was genuinely insane. If you wanted real political power in the late Roman Republic, you had to buy your way up every single rung of the ladder. Elections required bribery. Public festivals and games had to be funded out of your own pocket. Grain distributions, public works, legal fees, all of it came from the candidate himself. And the math at the top was brutal. The common wisdom in Rome at the time was that you needed to make 3 separate fortunes over the course of your career. One fortune to pay off the debts you racked up getting into office. A second fortune to bribe your way through the corruption trial that would inevitably follow. And a third fortune to actually live comfortably once the whole circus was over. Caesar looked at that system A and decided the answer was to borrow more. By the time he was in his mid-30s, Caesar had accumulated debts totaling around 1,300 talents. To put that in some kind of context, that sum could have funded an army of 110,000 soldiers for an entire year. Or you could throw roughly 150 of the most lavish banquets Rome had ever seen. Either way, it was a number that would have destroyed most men completely. Caesar was not most men. He looked at those debts not as a sign that he'd gone too far, but as evidence that he hadn't gone far enough yet. He needed a backer, someone rich enough to absorb the risk and smart enough to see what the investment was actually worth. That man was Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest person in Rome. In 61 before Christ, Crassus stepped in with a loan of 830 talents, which was roughly an eighth of his entire personal fortune, which tells you something about how much faith he had in Caesar's potential. Or, depending on how you look at it, how thoroughly Caesar had convinced him that their fates were now tied together. And this is where Caesar showed something genuinely brilliant. He understood something about debt that most people get completely backwards. He knew that a small debt makes the borrower a slave to the lender. But a truly colossal debt, the kind of debt that could ruin the lender if it went bad, that makes the lender a servant to the borrower's success. Caesar had made himself too expensive to fail. Crassus had no choice now but to see Caesar win, because if Caesar went down, a significant chunk of Crassus's empire went with him. With Crassus backing him, and some breathing room on his debts, Caesar did something that probably looked completely irrational to anyone watching from the outside. He spent more money, not on himself, not on luxury, but on the public. He staged massive gladiatorial games in honor of his father, who had been dead for 20 years at that point. The Senate actually had to pass a law limiting the number of gladiator pairs he could field, because he was planning something so large it was making them nervous. 320 pairs of fighters. The crowd absolutely loved it. Caesar understood something that most Roman aristocrats refused to admit, that popularity was a financial asset. It wasn't sentimentality. It was a calculated investment in the kind of goodwill that money couldn't directly buy, but that spending money could absolutely generate. This is the pattern that defined the first half of Caesar's career. He borrowed to spend, spent to build a reputation, and built that reputation into political capital that he then converted back into actual power and eventually into actual money. Every game, every grain distribution, every public speech where he positioned himself as a champion of ordinary Romans. All of it was going on the ledger, and the ledger was getting terrifying. But Caesar kept going, because he could see what most of his creditors couldn't. He wasn't building a lifestyle, he was building a brand. And in Rome in the 1st century before Christ, a sufficiently powerful personal brand was worth more than any amount of gold sitting in a vault. By 61 before Christ, Caesar had been elected praetor and got himself the governorship of Farther Spain as a result. His creditors tried to stop him from leaving Rome before his debts were settled, and this is the moment that should have ended everything. He's standing at the gates of the city, literally being physically detained by the men he owes money to. It takes Crassus personally guaranteeing a quarter of Caesar's debts just to get him out the door. Most people in that situation would feel the humiliation of it, the desperate scramble, the dependence on another man's mercy. Caesar apparently looked at it as a temporary inconvenience on the way to something much larger. He went to Spain. He ran a military campaign beyond the frontier of his province. He won loot for himself, his soldiers, and the treasury. He came back with enough to make partial payments and enough momentum to push toward his next move. That next move was the consulship, which he won in 59 before Christ, and with it came the piece of the puzzle that would change everything. Through a political alliance with Crassus and the general Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey, Caesar secured something he'd been maneuvering toward for years: command of the legions in Gaul. This alliance of three, which historians would later call the First Triumvirate, wasn't built on friendship or shared values or any of that. It was built on interlocking financial interests and mutual need. Caesar needed military command. Pompey needed political cover. Crassus needed Caesar to succeed so his investment would pay off. It was less a political movement and more a very high-stakes business arrangement between three men who didn't entirely trust each other. In 58 before Christ, Caesar took his legions north into Gaul and began what would become one of the most consequential military campaigns in the history of the ancient world. The Gallic Wars ran from 58 to 50 before Christ, covering the territory of what is today France, Belgium, and parts of Switzerland and Germany. And the scale of what Caesar extracted from those campaigns is almost difficult to comprehend. When he conquered a tribe called the Atuatushi, for example, he sold 53,000 of them into slavery. By Roman law, the profits from that transaction were his alone. That wasn't a one-time event. It was a repeating revenue model applied across tribe after tribe, city after city, for nearly a decade. The wealth was staggering, and it was flowing directly to Caesar. By 57 before Christ, Caesar had accumulated enough to start paying down his enormous debts in real, meaningful amounts. His stature had risen to a level that was making people in Rome genuinely uncomfortable. He wasn't just a clever politician anymore. He was a military hero with 8 loyal legions, a personal fortune, and a public image carefully constructed through a decade of spending and spectacle. He'd also been writing about all of it, documenting his campaigns in what would become De Bello Gallico, a work of military history that just so happened to present Julius Caesar as the most capable, fair-minded, and heroic commander Rome had ever produced. He was managing his own press. In a city where public opinion shaped political survival, that was not a small thing. The Gallic Wars concluded at the Battle of Alesia in 52 before Christ, where Caesar defeated the last major resistance under the Gallic leader Vercingetorix. That victory effectively made Caesar the ruler of the entire province of Gaul, with all of its resources at his disposal. He had gone from a debt-ridden aristocrat who couldn't leave Rome without someone else co-signing for him, to the military sovereign of one of the richest territories in the known world. And here's where the situation in Rome got genuinely dangerous. The Senate, backed by Pompey, who had by now split from Caesar, issued an ultimatum. Caesar had to give up his military command and return to Rome as a private citizen. And as a private citizen, he'd be immediately vulnerable to prosecution for actions taken during his time in office, which would strip him of everything. The debts weren't fully gone. The enemies were very real. Surrender meant ruin. On January 10th, 49 before Christ, Caesar stood on the northern bank of the Rubicon River with his 13th Legion and made the decision that no one who understood the stakes could honestly call impulsive. He crossed. This was illegal. Roman law forbade a general from bringing armed troops into Italy. Everyone knew it meant civil war. But Caesar had done the math, and the math said that going back meant losing everything he'd spent 20 years building. His creditors had made him who he was. His debts had pushed him to Spain, to Gaul, to 8 legions and a personal empire. Retreat now wasn't just political surrender. It was financial annihilation. So he crossed the river, and the Roman Republic effectively crossed with him. What followed was 3 years of civil war that Caesar won decisively. Pompey was killed in Egypt in 48 before Christ. His remaining opponents were defeated in Africa and Spain. By 46 before Christ, Caesar was appointed dictator, initially for 10 years, and then in early 44 before Christ, dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity. The man who once needed Crassus to bail him out of a room full of creditors now controlled the largest concentration of wealth and military power in the Western world. And he moved quickly to reshape the economic reality of Rome in ways that, not coincidentally, addressed the exact problems his own early career had been built on. One of his first significant acts was a sweeping debt reform that effectively canceled around a quarter of all outstanding debts in Rome. He remitted a full year of rent for poor tenants across the city and throughout Italy. He founded colonies for veterans and the urban poor. He reformed the calendar, the grain supply, the courts, and the system of provincial taxation. Some of this was genuine social concern for the people who had cheered for him through 2 decades of games and spectacle. Some of it was the simple logic of a man who had once been destroyed by debt and understood exactly how corrosive it was to a functioning society. And some of it, probably a significant chunk, was the calculated move of a ruler who needed a loyal population more than he needed a wealthy Senate. By the end of his life, Caesar's personal fortune had grown to somewhere between 2.5 and 3 billion sestertii. When you try to convert that to modern terms accounting for inflation and purchasing power, you land somewhere in the range of $3.5 to $4 billion. He had, at some point in the final years of his life, surpassed the fortune of Crassus himself, the man who had once stood between him and his creditors at the gates of Rome, the man who had been the backstop, the guarantor, the safety net. Caesar had outgrown the entire financial architecture that had made him possible. The men who assassinated him on March 15, 44 before Christ, the Ides of March, are often talked about as defenders of the Republic, idealists who couldn't stomach one man holding all the power. And some of them probably believed that. But you'd have a hard time ignoring the financial dimension of it. Caesar's economic reforms were directly redistributing wealth away from the senatorial class. His land grants and colonial foundations were eating into the landholdings of the old Roman elite. His tax reforms were squeezing the people who had gotten rich off the existing system. The men who stabbed him 23 times in the theater of Pompey weren't just political opponents. They were stakeholders in a system that Caesar was actively dismantling, and they were running out of time to stop him. Caesar had spent 40 years converting debt into power and power into wealth, at a scale that Rome had never seen. He'd borrowed when borrowing seemed insane, spent when spending seemed reckless, and risked everything at exactly the moment when the alternative was losing everything quietly. His creditors had chased him to the gates of Rome, and then he turned around and made himself into something so large the entire world had to deal with the consequences. 23 senators stood over his body in March of 44 before Christ, each certain they'd finally stopped him. They hadn't. Within 15 years, the Roman Empire his whole financial career had been building toward was fully operational. Because Caesar never feared debt, he wielded it as a weapon. If that lesson hit you, subscribe, and we'll keep reading history's ledger together.